I wonder if you spent much time dwelling on the theme of weakness in the Christian life. What's a Christian's relationship to weakness supposed to be? We know that we're supposed to be humble. Jesus made himself nothing, who was in very nature God, made himself nothing, becoming a servant, and that's the example that we are supposed to follow. We know that God works through weakness, and we know that we're supposed to turn the other cheek. But what does that look like in real life? Is that the same as letting people walk all over us? I remember as a teenager hearing that God works through weakness and suffering, and going home that night, getting down on my knees and praying that God would break me. Those were my words, that he would make me weak, make me suffer, because I thought that was the way to spiritual strength. Was that the right thing? Should Christians seek out suffering and weakness? You might say, on the other hand, didn't God say to Joshua 3 times, be strong and courageous? Don't we want to be strong and courageous? Don't we want our kids to be strong? We don't want them to be weak. Paul says much the same thing in the New Testament, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. It can be hard to work out what a Christian's relationship to weakness ought to be. But that's where today's passage takes us. In today's passage, we see how God works through weakness, not accidentally, but on purpose. He works through weakness in order to show his strength. That's the God that we know, God who works through weakness on purpose to show his strength. What that means for you and me we'll come to, but first let's take a look at the story. The story is set in what is now a familiar pattern in Judges. Israel, as we start in chapter 6, we'll be looking at chapters 6 through to 8 today. As we start in chapter 6, Israel did evil, God handed them over to oppression, they cry out, and God sends a deliverer. It's a familiar pattern by now in the book of Judges. And the first we hear of Gideon is that he's approached by an angel of the Lord and addressed as a mighty warrior. But from there, we're given a very different picture of Gideon. Not as a mighty warrior, but actually as quite a hesitant hero. So take a look with me back in 6 verse 13. The angel of the Lord has come to Gideon and said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. And Gideon says, pardon me, my Lord. But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? He remembers the stories of old, of God delivering his people. But he doesn't see that anywhere around him. For years they've been crushed and oppressed by the Midianite people. And so the angel says again, go in the strength that you have to save Israel out of Midian's hands. Am I not sending you? That is to say, that's what's happening right here, Gideon. This is the beginning of one of those stories that you remember. God is saving his people through you. But Gideon again replies in 15, pardon me, my Lord. But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family. And the Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down the Midianites. This whole interaction, that there's this constant back and forth where Gideon insists, I am not who you need. And God constantly assures, you don't need to be anything because I am everything you need. As we keep reading, Gideon asks for a sign, and the angel of the Lord burns up the offering miraculously. And Gideon trusts and goes out and acts. But he needs more. Soon enough, he asks for another sign, that the ground be wet and the fleece be dry in the morning. You might remember that story. When it happens in the morning, he second guesses it. What if it was just the dew? So he asks for it the other way around, the ground be dry and the fleece be wet the next morning. And it's just as he says. And even after that, there's one more miraculous assurance that we read. After the army is whittled down, as if anticipating God's need, God wakes him up in the middle of the night, sends him down into the Midianite camp to overhear a dream where he hears the Midianites prophetically anticipating his victory. And so God is very patient with Gideon. He's already given him 4 miraculous assurances before we really get into the real action of the story. And I assume that is because that is what Gideon needs. God works through one very hesitant hero. But then he does something even more surprising. We read at the start of chapter 6 how God whittles down the army quite deliberately from a sizable army to what is really just a feeble little band of men. So just to illustrate how radical this action is, take a look up on the screen. This is what happens. The army of Midian come and camp in the middle of the valley. They've been terrorizing the Israelites deep into their territory. So much so that the Israelites have fled up into the hills, hiding in the caves. And as they're camped there, the next slide shows us Gideon calls to arm first his own clan, and then sends messengers throughout all of the surrounding tribes. And people start to gather from all around on the hill above the valley, and a massive group rallies. The next slide says Gideon manages to summon some 32,000 men, which is epic. All these people from different tribes coming together to take a stand. It's a really heroic moment. After 7 years of crushing oppression, here is their chance. We learn later, and on the next slide, that the Midianite army was something closer to 135,000. And so there's still a small problem. They might hope that God would somehow miraculously quarter the numbers of Midianites to somehow even the playing field a bit before they charge in. But of course, we've just read that God doesn't do that at all, does he? God sends first anyone who trembles home, and we come to 10,000. And then God sends anyone who knelt down to drink home, and we're down to 300. And so we've gone from kind of notably outsized to just a truly incomparable feeble force. So they've got a hesitant hero, their feeble forces. The final thing they need is a plan. Now, on your outlines, I've called this toddler tactics. Maybe that's a little bit facetious. I have heard people trying to defend the strategy, like maybe a small strike force is what you need for a strategic infiltration. But I don't think that's what we're supposed to take away here. I call it toddler tactics because it does sound a lot like what my kids, like what I might hear out of their mouths as they play, as these people, these 300 charge in with jars and torches, ready to scare off the enemy. If you picture these 300 surrounding the enemy camp, all the way around the outside, with their jars ready to smash and their trumpets ready to blow, it is supposed to sound impossible with this small force against this massive army. It reminds me of another biblical story. You might remember just a few generations before this, God's people marched into the promised land. And when they come up against a huge fortified walled city, God told them to march around the border for 7 days and then to blow their trumpets. And it must have looked ridiculous. It's one of the things I think the VeggieTales series gets right, if you know the reference. It's a niche reference for those who remember, but in VeggieTales retells the stories of the Bibles with vegetables as the main characters. And at the point in this story, they look down from the walls and they say, "You silly little pickle, you silly little pea, you think that walking round will bring the city to its knees?" I think that captures the story of Jericho well. It must have looked ridiculous. And it's the same here. The point here is not that this is a brilliant military strategy. The point is that God can do the impossible. That's made very clear in verse 2. Why the hesitant hero? Why these feeble forces? Why the toddler tactics? Because this is a fight that is supposed to look unwinnable. We're supposed to look at this and think, what have you gotten yourselves into? There is no chance in the world this is going to work. And yet, it does. And the reason for that is given in verse 2. Take a look with me at chapter 7, verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me." So now announce to the army, he goes on to unveil his plan to whittle down the numbers. So do you hear what's happening there? God works through weakness on purpose to show his strength. Now, I love that verse because if you've read through the Bible a bit, you might have picked up on that theme. God regularly chooses to work through things that look weak. It's a theme throughout the whole Bible. It's part of who God is, but there's not many places we get it as clearly explained as this, as to why God does that. Often it's just a thing that's noted. So it's exciting here that we're given a reason because it gives us a massive insight into who God is. God works through weakness on purpose to show his strength, so that no one would be misguided as to whose victory it is and who should get the glory. Gideon's story has echoes all through the Old and New Testament. You think of the biggest names in the Old Testament and we'll see similar stories. Think about Moses, another hesitant hero. God announces that he's going to save his people from Egypt, and Moses says, "Who am I that I should go up to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Again, God announces his plan. He says, "What if they don't listen to me?" And after God miraculously assures him of turning his staff into a snake, he says, "Pardon your servant, Lord, but I've never been eloquent. I'm slow of speech and of tongue." And so God agrees to send Aaron along to help with some of the talking. And so people look back throughout the Old Testament on Moses as this hero, but God chose to work through really a bumbling man who is hesitant to step up. Another big name in the Old Testament is David, who also bears a lot of similarities to Gideon. Gideon says he's the weakest of his family in an insignificant clan. And David could say exactly the same thing. He's literally forgotten when the brothers are called up to decide who's going to be the next king. And there are countless other stories like this, where God seems quite intentionally to work through the insignificant, but it's here that we're actually told why. God chooses to work through the weak things to show his strength. Save that Israel would boast against him, trusting instead in their own strength. And so the final question I want to ask of Gideon's story is, well, who does get the glory? If God does this so that it would be unquestionably clear that it is God's work, that God would rightfully get the glory, well, let's take a look at how that went. Chapter 6 and 7, they run on this cycle of God assuring Gideon and Gideon acting in response. Gideon goes from really, really questioning things to nervously going out in the nighttime to destroy the idols of the town to boldly leading the charge against the Midianites. But for me, the first hint that perhaps something is not quite right is in 7 verse 18. In the peak of the action, as he explains the plan to the men, he says, "Go out and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." Now this is slightly odd. As they all smash their jars and blow their trumpets, they shout out for the Lord and for Gideon. Why for Gideon? Maybe you could say, maybe it's because he's heard in this dream that they're afraid of him, so maybe it would help kind of the plan. But as we keep reading, I wonder if it's something different. As we get into chapter 8, instead of this cycle of God assuring and Gideon acting, doing what the Lord commands, Gideon seems to grow relentless, ruthless, and even bloodthirsty. As he pursues the last of the Midianites, he threatens anyone who would stand in his way, killing all the men of an Israelite town just because the elders wouldn't bring him bread. And then making his motivation very clear that he's doing this for vengeance. He has an opportunity to say why he's doing what he's doing, and he says, "I'm doing this for vengeance because you killed people like me, so now I'm going to kill you." So it all starts, his character and all of it starts to get murky here, until we get to verse 22, where we start to get a clearer picture. I think this is the most ironic verse in the whole chapter. I hope you still have those words ringing in your ear. Why did God whittle down the numbers, choose to work through weakness? It's so that no one could say, "My own strength has saved me." But after the battle is finally won, the first words we hear are these, in verse 22, "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson." This is to Gideon. "Because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." So God says, no one should boast against me, saying my own strength has saved me. And they say, you, Gideon, have saved us. What's going on here? God gives them the best chance possible to turn back to him, and they instead turn to Gideon. And this glory that is supposed to be to God alone is redirected. And then Gideon gives the best response and the worst response. 23, he says, "I will not rule over you, and nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Yes, Gideon. But then he makes an idol. He gathers their gold and builds an ephod, which is a priestly garment out of pure gold. A pure gold ephod would not have been a practical or functional thing. This is set up as a monument to the victory that God gave them. And it's a strange thing that he makes an obscure priestly garment. I can see how... I wonder if this could have been a well-intentioned thing, as something meant to represent God. Like, all the other fake gods, they had their representation of God with their totem poles or whatever their symbol was of their God. I wonder if this might have been a symbol that they couldn't have mistaken for anything other than Yahweh, because this was something they knew from the priestly work, something that could represent Yahweh. But I mean, it might as well have been a golden calf or a battle shield. The point is that Gideon breaks the second commandment. You shall not form for yourself an image of anything in the heavens above, or the earth, or the waters below. And all of Israel ends up worshipping this golden statue instead of worshipping God. And even Gideon ends up turning that way. So instead of the glory going to God, the people try to redirect it to Gideon. And Gideon perhaps tries to redirect the glory off himself and onto God. It's redirected onto this monument to God's victory. But in the end, the people end up praising Gideon and worshipping a statue instead of rightly praising and worshipping the Lord. And so we finally reach this little epilogue at the end that tells us the people did have some peace for a little while, but no sooner did Gideon die than they turned back from Gideon's ephod to the Baals and other fake gods. And so I think there's an important lesson to learn from the book of from the section of the story of Gideon, which is that when we understand our weakness, we can rightly relate to God. So I want to turn now to 2 Corinthians. You might want to flip there if you can. Let me just read out a couple of verses from chapter 12 again, articulating what I've called the paradox of weakness, and listen to the difference between Paul and Gideon here. Paul says to the Corinthians in chapter 12, verse 9, he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in my weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Gideon's story highlights this concept really well. When Gideon was aware of his weaknesses, everything went perfectly. But when everyone started to recognize strength in him, that's when things started to go pear-shaped for them. I can't help but wonder what might have happened if Gideon boasted in his weaknesses instead. If he had have said, "Don't you see, we did this with 300 men and jars and trumpets. I'm no hero. We were impossibly weak. So this could only be God's victory." I can't help but wonder if Gideon boasted in his weaknesses, if things could have gone a bit differently for them. Because I think the point here is that when we're aware of just how small we are, that's when God is able to do his best work through us. A little bit earlier, and we won't turn there now, but in the letter, Paul has been speaking about having treasure in jars of clay. In that metaphor, we are the clay jars, just ordinary vessels. But the thing that we carry, the treasure that we hold, is the good news about Jesus. That Jesus was born in weakness, God born as a baby in a feeding trough in a stable, grown up in ordinary life to be a servant and die on a cross. That is the good news. That's the life of weakness, which is our treasure. Because it's in Jesus' apparent weakness that Jesus defeated sin and death and opened up a way for us to be with him forever. And so we started with a question, what is a Christian's relationship to weakness? I want to finish with a quote from J.I. Packer, which I think really helpfully resolves that paradox. When I am weak, then I am strong. Packer was someone very familiar with weakness. He was in a car accident when he was 7, and throughout school he had to wear an aluminium cap to cover a hole in his head. He couldn't really do the sport the other kids did. He never really felt like he fit in with the other kids. Spent a lot of his school life at the library. But it wasn't until more recently that it started to make sense for him. But by this point in his life, he's elderly. His body is failing. He's being reacquainted with weakness once again. And he looks back on his life and he sees how this theme of weakness has been under his skin ever since that car accident when he was 7. Sees in hindsight how it has led him to fight just a little bit too hard against anything that might look like weakness. How it's fed his pride in subtle but significant ways. And he writes these words, they'll come up on the screen. He can see now that the way to true spiritual strength, leading to real fruitfulness in Christian life and service, is the humble, distrustful way of consciously recognized weakness in spiritual things. There's a lot packed into that sentence. It's a very carefully worded sentence, a bit of a thesis statement for the book that he writes. But notice particularly the phrase, consciously recognized weakness. It is not that a Christian needs to go out and make themselves weak. We are but clay jars holding immeasurable treasure. We are already weak, and the more we can understand our weakness in spiritual things, the more we're able to go out rightly in the strength of God. If Gideon and his army had have looked to their own strength, it would have been nonsense. If if he'd go on and mustered people, come on guys, we're 300 strong and we've got jars and trumpets, they don't stand a chance against us. Instead, he goes through the camp and he says, get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands, because that was where their strength was. His weakness, at least initially, allows him to lean only and wholly on the strength of God. But as soon as he starts to lose sight of his own weakness, even as stark as it is, things start to go wrong for him. So the more that we can do to foster an awareness of our weakness in spiritual things, the better. A humble, distrustful way of life, as J.I. Packer says it, is not to say, woe is me, I am terrible. It's to say, I don't think I can do this, Lord, but I know that you can. Weakness is not our goal, but our reality. We shouldn't be afraid of our weakness because we know that God works through weak things of this world to show his strength. So I've written a little prayer at the bottom of your outlines, which I'll pray just to close. Almighty God, you are worthy to receive glory and honor and power. Would you please quiet our prideful hearts? Help us to know you and ourselves better by your word, and so live godly, righteous, and obedient lives to the glory of your holy name. Amen.